Welcome, everybody. I'm back here today to talk about The Secret, a Treasure Hunt by Byron Preiss. It's been a while since I made a new video, and I wanted to talk about this topic for quite a while. I really feel like the community is focusing on some of the wrong things and not reading the book with the correct perspective. And there are some narratives that have kind of been taken as truth within the community. So I'll try to maybe dispel some of those and along the way give you kind of just a different perspective on how you should be looking at things within the book. If you talk to anyone that believes the treasure hunt is very straightforward and the instructions are given to you in the book, they're often going to point you to things like the only way you're going to find the treasure is to combine a painting with a verse. And they're going to just stick to that. And so what I'm going to be kind of going through is some of the alternative ways of looking at the book and how you might be actually missing out on some of the really important information that is contained within it. They wouldn't be completely wrong, though, because you're not going to find the treasure without using the verse and the painting. But what I'm going to show you is that there are reasons why you shouldn't be just using those. There are some things in the book which will definitely point to the importance of the painting and the verse. There's also this poem here right before the paintings where it says to match the verses with the paintings. You have this one here, wed one picture with one verse. There have been instances in the newspaper articles when the book first came out. This one says a description of the responsible parties. The fair people takes up 3/4 of the book, though the description is completely irrelevant to the treasure hunt. That section right there was referring to the field guide. This is an article written by, some reporter who I would have to assume got that information from Byron while they were doing an interview. This one's a little bit more specific because this was on Quest for Treasures after the Cleveland cast was found by Brian and Andy, and Brian took some time to recall some of the things he had talked about with Byron Preiss. And one of the things down here in number 5, he also said that the pages following the verses, which make up the bulk of the book, have no connection with the puzzle and contain no additional clues. So that's a lot of information right there that supports the idea that you just need to use the verse and the painting. What I'm going to kind of do at the beginning here is just dispel some of the narratives that have been around for a long time about how the book was put together. One of those is that the writers that Byron Preiss hired, Sean Kelly and Ted Mann, they had written their own book prior to The Secret. And it was a book on the fairies of Central Park. And that book essentially became the field guide. And that's the narrative. And since it was written before The Secret, a lot of people will discount what's in the field guide entirely because they say it was already written as the fairies of Central Park. The problem with that, as you can see in this first column over here, is it kind of explains how everything went. So yeah, this book, The Fairies of Central Park, was written, and it says Kelly had long been interested in fairies. Okay, after several publishers had turned down the idea, that's when Byron Preiss entered the picture. He can take somebody else's book, package it with some other information, and make something that potentially publishers will want to buy. They'll point to that as their evidence. The field guide portion of the book was previously written. That means it would have nothing to do with the verses and the paintings which came after their Fairies of Central Park book. The problem is that they tend to ignore the other information that tells us the actual sequence and order of events that happened within the writing of The Secret. The first is that when Byron contacted them, Preiss suggested a few changes. He decides he wants to package their book within his project. And now he's suggested a few changes. The story now is that 300 years ago, the fair people fled the old world for the new. That is the central theme of the book. That is the immigration theme, where you have the old world fairies coming to the new world and essentially mirroring the immigration that we experienced in North America. So that was the original suggested changes by Byron from the book about the Central Park fairies to what The Secret essentially became. In a different article, he had a quote, "My humor is childish, always has been. The original idea of the book was to explain the different fairy migrations. That was the original idea. Then the publisher decided we needed to have a fairy for each of the 50 states. Like a place like Minnesota has got to have its fairies included. We ended up with 70 creatures." So that decision came after the decision to change their book from the Central Park fairies to a book about the immigration of the fairies from the old world to the new. Now they've decided to add a fairy for every state, and that is the field guide section of the book. So that had to be written entirely new by Sean Kelly and Ted Mann after their project had been included within The Secret by Byron Preiss. And you can see this one over here on the right seems to give some supporting evidence for that, because this project is something that they worked on for 2 years. It says the talent the 29-year-old Preiss enlisted for The Secret worked on speculation for a year until the project was sold to Bantam Books. Besides Palancar, Preiss hired Sean Kelly and Ted Mann of the National Lampoon to write 2/3 of the book, sculptress Joellen Trilling, 2 other illustrators, and a photographer. 9 people working for 2 years on a project that is, in several senses of the word, speculative. It kind of shows you how much time was needed to put this book together. You're not going to need 2 years as a writer if you've already written the book in your Fairies of Central Park. You're going to need 2 years to rewrite it if you have to come up with an entirely new fairy immigration theme, and you're going to have to come up with 70 plus different fairies, all from different states, to be included in the back of the book as the field guide. We've heard from JJP about the creative process between him and Byron. And he has said in different instances that he was told to include certain things in the paintings that he had no idea what they were. If he is unaware of things he's being told to add into the paintings, then you could also imply that whatever was being written by Sean Kelly and Ted Mann, Byron could have been instructing them to include things in their writings without them knowing what the purpose was, the same way he was doing with JJP. And JJP also has told us that working on this project was like working on the Blackbird, which was at the time a super secret military spy plane, in that every group was working on something different, but yet they didn't know what the other group was working on. So everything was very secretive, it was all classified, and only a few people maybe at the top knew what all the other people were doing. I would imagine this was very much like that. Byron was in charge, he knew what everybody else was doing, and each group only knew about their little piece of this treasure hunt. For example, Sean Kelly and Ted Mann, who were writing the field guide, they would be writing about these fairies that they were creating, but if Byron was instructing them to include certain things within the writings, they wouldn't have any real idea of why they were having to include it. So when we get to the actual description of what the secret is, on the very first page, you get this invitation to participate. And I think one of the things that people overlook on this page is how it's called a mythology for the modern world. The word mythology is kind of important because it's a compilation of myths for a group of people. And so, for example, you might have the mythology of the Norse gods. And so you have things like Odin and Thor and Loki and all the stories that go with all of those gods. That would be the mythology for that group of people, right? For that culture. Mythology is like the study of the myths, all the stories. And that's exactly what we're talking about here with this genre of folklore. It's a set of stories that's been created about the old world fairies coming to the new world. That's the immigration part. And then what happened to them once they actually were here for a long time. They ended up marrying each other, having a lot of intermingling of their species, and which led to all these fascinating results, which they describe as their descendants. And those are the fairies that exist now in our modern world. And those fairies are still messing with us. They're doing things that will affect our day-to-day lives, and that's the funny, sort of humorous, satirical part of the back of the book known as the field guide. The actual term myth, in the way it's being used, it is a genre of folklore. It's a different usage of the word than, for example, saying, hey, that's just a myth, meaning it's referring to something that's just not true. This is actually an important distinction because there are places in the book, which we'll cover here in just a minute, that kind of show the difference between a myth, meaning the collection of stories about this group or society, versus a myth meaning something that just isn't true. So getting back to how Byron was thinking about this treasure hunt. This article was probably one of the most important that speaks to his mindset as he was approaching this treasure hunt. The jewels described in the treasure are a peace offering from the fair people, Preiss said in all seriousness. They are the elves and trolls and ride maidens and others, 12 groups in all, who fled from the old world when civilization began to encumber them. They migrated to the new world and encountered the Indians, whom they liked because the Indians had a great respect for nature. But 300 years later, the new world was quote-unquote discovered, and pretty soon the newcomers began to crowd the fair people again. They have nowhere to go, so they have offered jewels in exchange for the right to live beside man peacefully. Preiss spoke so earnestly that I became a believer. But why had the fair people let the Bantam Company hide the precious stones? They trust us, Preiss said, because we have told their story honestly. We're the mediators, sort of, between the fair people and man. I understood completely. That right there shows the mindset that we need to have when we are reading the book. This book and this project was created within the mind of Byron Preiss. And I see a lot of people try to get into Byron's mind and try to think like he would think. They say things like, well, Byron was from Brooklyn, so he's obviously going to hide one in Brooklyn. Or they say things like Byron loved the Civil War, so all of his puzzles are going to have something about the Civil War in them. One was found on a baseball field. Well, Byron was a big baseball fan, so that's why he hid one of them on a baseball field. If you are thinking about this treasure hunt in the terms of how Byron would think about it, you're going about it the wrong way. Because the way the mythology of the book is written, he has essentially written himself into their story. It is the fair people's story. It is their story. It is their treasure hunt. They are giving us a book that has all of their information in it to try to help us solve their treasure hunt. Byron is just the intermediary. He is approaching it from the standpoint that the fair people are real. They've contacted him, and he has written what they have given him. The instructions within their book come from them. And so we don't have to think about how Byron would think about this, because he's already telling us with the book the way he thinks about it. He's giving us the information in the book because that is how Byron thinks the fair people would think. That's the whole concept that you need to wrap your brain around. It's not about what Byron thinks. He's giving us how the fair people think in the book. That's the mythology. And so we have to look at it from their perspective. How do they think about us? And how do their traditions and how they have given us their information affect how we should look for their treasure? Until we start doing that, we're going to be going down all of these paths that are just from a fundamental standpoint approaching the puzzle from the wrong perspective. You can see that in this letter to Rob after they found the Chicago puzzle. Byron signed the letter that he wrote, Byron Preiss and the Fair People. This idea that he was part of their project extends right to how he was signing off, even on letters when casts were found. The idea of the secret itself being something that the fair people gave to Byron because they trust him is confirmed when he talks about how this book has ruined him when he's talking to somebody. He has a quote, "This book has ruined me at cocktail parties. If anyone asks me if I've ever been to a certain city, I always have to say yes, I have, and I enjoyed it. I can't let anyone rule out any possible location." So right there, he's telling us that he is willing to lie to protect what the secret is all about. He's not going to give away any information, okay, especially information that could potentially rule out a location. Think about how that relates to him having a conversation with Brian about other puzzles and about other parts of the book that maybe he didn't want to share the information from the fair people as well. If you still don't believe that this idea that it's about the fair people, here's a few examples from the book itself. This first one, this comes from the very back of the book when it's talking about the form that you used to be able to send in if you wanted to try to claim the treasure and you were unable to go explore it in person. It says, if you are correct and have successfully completed the form herein, we will retrieve the treasure cask. You will receive the treasure jewels, but the cask shall remain the property of the fair people. So that tells you right there how much they were using this mythology that this is the fair people's treasure hunt. It's not ours. It's not Byron's. It's theirs. Another part, this was in the front of the book. It says, best of all, you will learn your role in the fair people's story. Again, it's their story. And the second part, I think, is often overlooked. And the significance of the quest for their treasure in the relationship between man and the fair people. I'm going to ask you a question right now. If you believe that all you need are the verse and the painting, then why is the significance of the quest for their treasure, why is it significant that we understand the relationship between man and the fair people? If all it comes down to are the verses and the paintings, why is our relationship significant? So what do we know about the fair people? Okay, we are given a lot of information about them, and we're also given a lot of information about how they think about us, and then we're given a lot of information about how they have interacted with us. So this first one is from the perspective in the book. This is coming from the Native Americans passed down. It comes to us in the book from their perspective. And so it says, when they arrived, speaking of the fair people, these visitors spoke many strange languages which were impossible to understand. But they must have been very intelligent people, for they soon learned the language of the Yarans. What's important here is to take away that the fair people are very intelligent because they were able to learn their language very quickly. Don't underestimate just how smart the fair people are, especially as it comes to their interactions with us. This one, the Litany of the Jewels, they love all these beautiful things, starshine and flowers, trees, basically all these things within nature. And it describes them as preternatural, which is sort of outside of nature. It goes on to describe, their precious stones, which are the jewels, and it describes them as, when it comes to jewelry, the fair people can be jealous, greedy, vain, quarrelsome, possessive, treacherous, almost in a word, human. How do they describe man? They describe man as the unbelieving and unbelievable. The unbelieving part refers to how man doesn't believe in fairies. They think they're myth as in something that's not true. When, as we described in the beginning, the mythology that he's created is a set of stories about their culture. From the standpoint of they are actually creatures that exist, and they've given us this opportunity to find their treasures. The unbelievable part is that man will lie. Man can't be believed. That's coming directly, again, from the fairies' perspective. They've been next to us invisibly, watching us and messing with us this entire time. And so they have a very good understanding of the qualities that make up man. It says, man who hates and fears himself and thus despises every living thing. They see us as the destroyer of all things in nature. They look at our fields and roads and walls as a very straight and unnatural geometry. They're basically against everything that we've created within civilization. They want the natural world. This idea that believing in the fairies is important is also reinforced within some of the descendants of the fair people in the field guide section of the book. This one comes from The Nightmare, and it says, the last quickly acquired a family with whose roving members city dwellers are by now all too familiar. Hugger-muggers, firebugs, and street gangs, and the rest, all of whom prove the axiom of fairy historian J.M. Barrie. That is the author that wrote Peter Pan. And the axiom is, if enough people believe in them, they can come true. That is referencing Tinker Bell. Because in the Peter Pan story, Tinker Bell was on the verge of dying, and the only way that she could be saved was if enough humans believed in her as a fairy. And if they truly believed, then she would be saved. You also have another fairy in the book called the Tinker Bells, straight from the Peter Pan story, using Tinker Bell as a play on words for one of the other fairies. Another one comes from the Bugbears. The bugbears were associated with the woods and getting people lost in the woods. And so it says, when the great forests of Europe were hewn to make pulp, to make paper, to make books, which denied the existence of fairies, the bugbears took the hint and immigrated to the well-wooded shores of the New World. So again, they are talking about man tearing down their forests to make paper, to make books, which then denied the existence of the fairies. And here they are giving us a book, ironically, about their existence. We need to take the hint, just as the bugbears did as they immigrated to the wooded shores of the New World. In the very beginning of the book, as it's talking about the passage to the New World, there are a few examples of the early passage of the first fairies, and those fairies mirrored some of the early explorers in human history, like Columbus. But most of the fair people deem the exploits of Alf and Brandon to be mere myth. Even legends, it seems, look down on legends. So what it's talking about there, when it says mere myth, it's talking about just a story that isn't true. It's essentially the same thing that people have done, looking down on the legends of the Vikings and other explorers that maybe came before Columbus, before he, quote unquote, discovered America. Another one that kind of goes into the idea of, quote unquote, myths is this paragraph down here in the bottom right-hand corner. How long the fairy folk of the old world dwelt peacefully among the natives of the new, no one knows. There are certainly enough quote-unquote Indian myths to establish the historical veracity of the immigration and cohabitation. When you're using quotes like this, you're using it as a stylistic choice to indicate irony or skepticism, or that the writer doubts the validity of the word or phrase. And so there is an irony here with this, because it's saying there is enough quote-unquote Indian myths. The Indian myths part would be what man says they are, because man doesn't believe in these myths. They say those things aren't true. But what this is saying is there's certainly enough to establish the veracity about this immigration of the fair people and their cohabitation with the initial Native Americans. So it's not a myth. That's why they put it in quotation marks. These aren't just Indian myths. These are real stories that have been handed down to us from the Native Americans. Again, it's trying to tell us that we need to take these stories seriously because these things will tell us what we need to know. This part is probably the most important for understanding why I believe we're looking at things from the wrong perspective. These are the fairy traditions towards man. Since that time, every elf and troll, goblin and brownie, djinn and ruskalki, shapeshifter and even the dragon have been hiding invisibly beside us, above us, below us, watching us, teasing us, helping us in the proud fairy tradition of playful torture and occasional benevolence towards man. That's their tradition. Okay, they've been all around us and they've been hiding invisibly wherever we're at, because this was at the time of the vanishing. So they had just left and they were going to leave us as we had come to the new world. But it says, for even in their invisibility, the temptation to make mischief among those who had come to the new world was irresistible to the fair people. From the safety of the wilderness, they would venture forth into civilization for their own amusement. It was the best of both worlds. So they were going into hiding. They were going to be amongst us invisibly, but they couldn't resist the temptation to make mischief with us, because that's what fair people do. The entire culture of mythology around folklore has to do with how fairies have interacted with mankind. And what this is telling us is that even when they decided to vanish and to leave us and to hide from us, even then they still couldn't resist coming back and messing with us. That idea is central to the book. Because even though they are coming to us in peace and offering us a truce and offering us a chance to find their gems, they cannot and will not be able to overcome the fairy tradition of playful torture and occasional benevolence towards man. When I talk about how Byron would think, the fair people think, that's what I'm talking about. He would think, well, if they do this all the time for their entire history, then if they give us a book to write, they're going to continue doing that. That's the perspective you need to have. So here we finally get to their peace offering. They offered us a truce. What I'm going to point out is the meaning for why they chose to quote a poem in this last section of their peace offering. It says, the fairies, quote, keep their ancient places, turn but a stone and stir a wing. 'Tis your estranged faces that miss the many splendored thing. So that right there is almost word for word a stanza in the poem called In No Strange Land by Francis Thompson. Now, the important part about why he chose this poem is written about God and religion and how us questioning God's existence is something we shouldn't be doing because the evidence for his existence is all around us. And so they start off with the first three stanzas basically saying, would the birds be so foolish to ask, where's the air? Or the fish to ask, where's the sea? It's all around them, okay? Just them being within it is almost evidence in and of itself. It says, when the evidence of God's existence is all around us, why are we questioning it? That's the whole point of this poem. It says in the first three stanzas, Thompson speaks in the first person plural, we, our, in a soft and inclusive way. But in the last three stanzas, he becomes more pointed, breaking out into second person singular to address you, the reader, directly. It's you who's willfully ignoring all of this divine activity that's taking place right in front of you. But in The Secret, it's not talking about God. It's not talking about angels. It's talking about the fairies. It says the fairies keep their ancient places. The evidence is all around us. We're given a book that has everything in it about them. Are we just going to ignore that? The evidence is right in front of you. I don't understand why you wouldn't use it. And then it tells us, in our land and in our time, the fair people and their treasures yet wait to be discovered. If man is good and kind and playful, he and she will find them. That is the secret. So we have to be the way they are. They are good and kind and playful. And if we don't think like that, we're not going to figure out what the secret really is. Stop thinking about things from the perspective of man and start thinking about things from the perspective of the fair people. This is the way they think. How would that impact the way we read what they've given us? And finally, I mentioned before that the mythology that Byron has created, him and his group of people that are working on this book, they are part of the story. They are the mediators between the fair people and man. It was their job to take the information from the fair people and put it into this book so that we could then search for their treasures. Byron was trusted by the fair people. He was entrusted with the secret. I mentioned before how he's willing to lie to protect the secret. And so anything that he's told us or that the people within this group have told us, we can't take to be straightforward and always the truth because they are part of the game. Their job is to protect the fair people, to protect this idea that whatever they have hidden within their book is what we need to figure out. If there is hidden things in there, it's up to us to read between the lines and figure it out. And this page right here has a key word at the top. Persona. A persona is an aspect of someone's character that is presented or perceived by others. It's a role or a character adopted by an author, an actor, or someone in a game. It's their role within the story. They are a persona. The origin of the word will tell you clearly what's happening here. It literally means a mask, a character played by an actor. They are playing characters within the story. When Byron says there's nothing in the back in the field guide, he is playing a role within their story. They've required from him to tell their story, not his story, their story. And their story in their tradition towards man is always going to be to cause mischief, but occasionally to help us. In some of my future videos, I'm going to go into the different ways that the fair people hide their information and how we can know what to look for. But for this video, I just want you to start thinking about how can I look at this puzzle differently from a different perspective so that I can be in the right frame of mind as I read the book. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe.